For our Zentangle project, we are focusing on three major art vocabulary: line, pattern, and contrast. So I'm going to talk to you about some tips, and some techniques, and some requirements for this drawing project for you. First of all, you will notice that I have given you several things, such as some example pages to use. When you look at these example pages, there's a couple of different types that you're going to find. Sometimes it's just examples of a pattern that's completely finished, like this example right here. There's a lot of different ones that you're going to be able to look through and determine how to do them on your own, or you might have to kind of test it a few times to figure out the pattern. So if we look at something like striples, that one's probably pretty easy to figure out. Same for this one. However, some of the patterns are going to be a little bit more difficult. What is the best way to go about this pattern? Or what is the best way to go about this pattern? So some we're going to require a little bit more testing or playing around with, whereas others are going to come a little more naturally to you. Sometimes your peers have a different one that just clicks for them and then you have for yourself. Everybody's brain works a little bit differently. We're also drawn to different patterns, which makes this project really interesting because nobody's will ever come out similar to another person's. Another example of sheets that you might be getting for examples might have step-by-step directions. In these step-by-step directions, you're going to notice that you have some where they'll take you literally one part at a time until you get a completed process. So there are some pages that are going to look like this, where you have lots of examples, and then there are some pages like this, where you have the finished product, but not the steps as you go. Other things that you need to consider are that I'm going to give each one of you this worksheet or something very, very similar to it. In this worksheet, what you're going to notice is that you are going to have to create, as a requirement for your final drawing, 20 different patterns. You're going to keep a record of 20 patterns on here. If you create more than 20, you only have to put up to 20 on this worksheet. Anything beyond 20 is fine. You just don't have to record it. So as I go through my patterns, there's a couple of things that I will tell you. Keep a scrap of paper around. It can be something beat up. It can be something from the mail. It doesn't matter. But you want to protect the surface of whatever you're drawing on. So I'm not going to draw with a Sharpie that's going to bleed through a piece of paper directly onto my table because I don't want to have to deal with Sharpie on the table. And I would never put my actual drawing paper underneath this Zentangle worksheet where you document your patterns because it would also bleed through and end up ruining this. So as I'm creating my patterns, say that as I start my design right here, I am just going to pick any old pattern that I want. It doesn't really matter what that pattern is going to be. I have two ways of going about this. I could just start a pattern and just put it in. So say I just create this pattern here, and maybe I make a border on the bottom. But another option is that I can create as if I pretend that a string has been dropped on my piece of paper, dividing my project up into several sections. So I might start here, and then I might pretend that there's another string this way. Now, I will tell you, I'm probably drawing too fast with my Sharpie, and that's why it looks like the ink is fading out. Whereas if I keep my Sharpie upright and go a little bit slower, notice how the ink is much darker and cleaner. Never draw with your Sharpie sideways, which is hard because that's how we typically write. You want to make sure your Sharpie is upright as much as possible because the ink is going to flow out of it better. There's a lot of times my students tell me this Sharpie is dead, and it just is a matter of how you're holding it. You can always test your Sharpie on your worksheet here and see how it's doing. If I draw on the side, notice how the Sharpie doesn't come out as clear. So keeping it upright makes a huge difference on this. Also, I want you to notice what type of Sharpie I am using. This is called an ultra fine point Sharpie. This Sharpie is great for Zentangles because you can get awesome small details. What I'm not going to do is use my thick Sharpie. This is going to make your overall project lack what it really needs to have in contrast and design. The patterns, when we look at examples of finished products, they have these really neat looking patterns, and it's because they're all small and tight and close together. If the patterns are made with this regular Sharpie, they're going to end up being too thick. You're going to lose details, and overall it doesn't have the same craftsmanship and quality that we're looking for. So let's look at some examples for us. What I would tell you is I can show you some examples that I've done in the past. These are just in a book that I made for myself that was a planner, but you'll notice I made each of these designs. Sometimes I'm going to make places thicker and darker, or I'm going to color them in. Now, when I get to something like these circles right here, I did end up making those thicker places with my thicker Sharpie and not my thin Sharpie. So there are sometimes occasions that you would choose differently. For example, if I was doing this poke leaf pattern, I would draw the entire pattern in with my regular Sharpie, my very thin Sharpie. Then I would do the part that's getting colored in my regular Sharpie. But you want to limit that. If an entire section is colored in dark, it's just going to look like you messed up a pattern, didn't know what to do, and just colored over the whole thing. You don't want to do that. You need to have good contrast, but the entire area needs to be filled. Now, I will say, this is not a great example of having good contrast. If you squint at this, almost the entire thing is the same value, which means light or dark. There's a couple places that are really dark and bold, like this here, that pop and stand out to you. But for the most part, the entire thing is all the same. That's because my goal on this wasn't to create a Zentangle, but was to create a coloring book page. So in the end, I didn't want to have places colored in solidly because I was hoping that I would go through and color it myself. So that's an example of why my project or my example is slightly different than yours. If we look at some other examples I can show you, here would be a great example of one that looks like it is a finished product. When you squint at this one, there are places that are darker, bolder, and they pull your eye in. Then there are some places that are lighter values, thin lines that are slightly spaced more apart. This allows the viewer to have a more interesting composition, and your eye flows around the page. So I don't get stuck in just one spot. I move or bounce around and have movement because these different values help my eye create interest in new places, and I travel around the work of art. This is an exact example of the kinds of things that you could be going for. Notice it's not just leaving a bunch of empty places. Instead, it's making some patterns bold and dark and some patterns thinner and more spaced out. But they do this mostly in just that thin Sharpie that I was talking about. However, there are a few places I bet they went in with a thicker Sharpie to bolden it up. No large areas just colored in or left completely on its own. Another thing I want to point out is that I've only given you so many examples. If you go onto Google and you just look at, say, Zentangle patterns step by step, you're going to find a ton of examples that are just going to walk you through different steps on how to make some of these patterns. You can also just do Zentangle patterns. So there's more options to you than what I have given you. I would also like to point out, if we look at my example one more time, if I switch back over to that you're required to do 20 patterns. You can do 20 patterns. In this book alone, I have 101 patterns. So I know that you can do 20. I believe in you. I will also say that if you want to have a different option, you can do this in color. It's not the same as doing it with big markers. What I did for this was just ballpoint pens that were in color. I tend to have a lot of colored pens around because I just like to write with them. So it wasn't hard for me to come up with an example where I used those patterns, but I included color. But remember, my focus is line, pattern, and contrast. So you want to be able to create places that are thick and thin, places that are dark, places that are light, and places that are medium so that your eye moves around the work of art until you have a finished product.